Hello, thank you for joining and welcome to another presentation in the class series. Today, we're going to get to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that's wildlife rescue and rehabilitation. So our little pictures here, we have a little baby squirrel in rehabilitation. Here we have a hawk release, and here we have a chryson that was an orphan at his time of release here after rehabilitation, just for some examples. Let's turn this and let's jump in. So we will talk a little bit, I will introduce wildlife rehabilitation, and then we will talk about rescue situations, a little bit on myths and the reality and the many risks and challenges. I will, of course, mention when the vet's needed, and then we will talk about when to intervene. And yeah, oftentimes it is more important to know when not to intervene. So step one is the assessment. We will talk about that. And yeah, is it actually an emergency? I will give you some common non-emergency examples. And we come to step two, make a plan, talk about human safety, talk about animal safety. Then I will present tools of the trade for capture. And yeah, every species is different, requires specific training, and there is also countless different situations. Ultimately, I will show you all sorts of examples for restraint in different species, and the last step will be a few words and guidelines for transportation. This is a pretty long presentation, and we will start with the first half now, and then I will record the second half in another take. So why do you want to learn this? There are a lot of mistakes that are often made and can actually make things worse and or take a very high risk for yourself as well. So this first step is always the proper assessment. You do want to make sure you and your charges stay safe. Of course, it's good to build your confidence to then ultimately use proper equipment and common sense in the process, hopefully. I do often get approached by people saying, just teach me how to rescue animals. And I have to say, take a step back. There is a lot of steps that you need to learn before you can actually rescue anything. And a lot of this was already mentioned in the talks about health assessment. So, but what is wildlife rehabilitation? In simple words, it means to care for injured, orphaned, or sick wildlife with the goal to ultimately return them to their natural habitat. Please, if you're interested in wildlife rehabilitation, check out the NWRA as well as the IWRC, the International Wildlife Rehabilitation Council. And there is a lot of benefits to becoming a member. They provide a lot of references, have an excellent annual conference. There are lists of certified rehabilitators and rehabilitators with different species, specializations, and by geographic location as well. These two entities jointly have also developed these minimum standards for wildlife rehabilitation. So there is a whole science and standards and guidelines for this field. There's also a code of ethics by these associations that is very recommendable because, yes, there are many, many, many myths. Please see the reading list. There is an article which you can also find online by the name of Wildlife Rehabilitation, Is It For You? By the Wildlife Rehabilitators Project. This article really does a fabulous job to dispel some of the common myths. And here is just one first example with myth 1 in this article, which to a rehabilitator, it's seems very counterintuitive, but to people who have never really heard or learned about wildlife rehabilitation, they may think that anyone who finds an injured or orphaned animal can just take it home and care for it, and it will just be wonderful. No, the truth is wildlife needs very special care, especially when they're injured or orphaned. Without this special care, especially diet and setups, as well as, of course, medical treatments, they will most likely just suffer and die. And of course, you all are already aware of disease risks, zoonosis risks, and injury risks that these animals can carry. And of course, inappropriately released wildlife is where good intentions can really turn into big problems for wild populations. Of course, legislation also plays a role. In most countries and states, licenses and permits are required to handle or possess wildlife. And yeah, it's to summarize, it's a very serious activity. And every species has special requirements. I missed the last 3 letters. So what does it take to rehabilitate wildlife? It's a pretty lengthy, complicated process with many steps, depending on what life stage these animals start the process. It may start with stabilization, treatment, recovery, and it may go through the different life stages of this animal to sub-adult and then pre-release and release, to just give one example. It differs by species. We spend a lot of time creating habitats, starting already upon intake in sometimes very small enclosures, setups, to create as much as possible a comfortable habitat with natural enrichment in it. Diets are another big challenge and very important topic in rehabilitation. And generally speaking, rehabilitation excludes humans as much as possible. We have to minimize our interaction and these stimuli. So another common myth may be that one gets to cuddle and snuggle with wildlife babies. And that is also not true. We have to constantly minimize the stress, which can be extremely challenging and stressful. It takes a lot of time, patience, and yes, funding sources with an exclamation mark. Another common myth may be that governmental entities may pay for this. No, in general, you have to raise your own funds. You need a lot of references and start building networks of experts and advisors. You also need to build a very high tolerance for mortality and conflict victims, which can truly be challenging on a daily basis. So what do? We do teach animals to survive independently. We want them to seek their food, shelter, and of course, avoid predators, which includes us humans. Ensuring their full physical capacity as well as adequate health and condition. A limiting factor for rehabilitation can also be the availability of release areas. To name just another example of what all it takes, it is multidisciplinary from the report and rescue throughout the rehabilitation to the release and identifying release areas and more. So what do we hope for? Yes, survival, of course, but also thriving. And last but not least, what we really want in a rehabilitated animal is to reproduce, to then continue to contribute to the wild populations of the future. So that's it in a nutshell for what is wildlife rehabilitation. There is a lot more to be said about it, and there is training and certifications for it too. But now to the importance of trained veterinarians in this field. And also veterinarians trained in wildlife are very important, because recognizing these diseases really does require special training and knowledge of these species in order to know the normals, to be able to differentiate when something is abnormal. And for most vet schools, that is extracurricular for you to study. And then, of course, domestic animal veterinarians can also build on their knowledge and with a lot of research for every species and case, with good references and networks, play a very important role in this. It's not just wildlife veterinarians, actually. There is a lot of cooperation with other domestic species veterinarians. Already mentioned, releasing a diseased animal can be detrimental to wild populations. An example of that would also be pox virus. Aside the fact that releasing unhealthy animals will lead to unnecessary suffering of these animals after turning them loose. Veterinarians also bring that knowledge of ongoing outbreaks in populations, be it wildlife or domestic, that may affect the species seen. And ultimately, veterinarians are crucial to protect the health and safety of the humans as well as the animals involved. So when in the process is the vet needed, an intake examination should be done by a veterinarian to diagnose and provide surgery and or treatment plans, and follow up with a conclusion after treatment, depending on species and case. Be it injury, there may be more frequent health checks. If it is just animals being reared by rehabilitators, there may be fewer health checks throughout the process, but in most cases there is a pre-release health check. In some countries, again, that is pretty strictly regulated and may include all sorts of diagnostics as well, again, to protect wild populations from introducing diseases that species that may have come in contact with others may bring to the wild populations. So countless challenges we see from neonatal diseases. We have in the issue of animals, newborns or juveniles that may imprint on a human instead of their own species, or habituate, which may prevent them from being releasable in most cases. So a challenge is to be able to socialize the species that require socialization, which makes it a big problem to have single orphans, especially of species that are social, because they need to have that companionship in their growing up. Animals need to be able to recognize themselves, so their own species, in order to be considered for release. They need to also recognize predators, aka humans need to be responded to appropriately, which is generally fear and flight. And yeah, orphans that have been poached very early on their own sometimes have very slim chances because they have not had the time to learn their own species. And if they don't know what they are not suitable for release and survival in the wild. Very, very often, we don't have any history. And a big problem is to not know where they're from, because in an ideal world, we want to return them as close as possible to their site of origin. And the more we know about the history, the better. But as said, sometimes we have absolutely nothing, just a box with an animal in it. And we don't even know what it is, or if it's alive until we open the box. Sourcing the knowledge about all the different species that can be encountered, which in our case is hundreds, is a challenge. To create the proper habitat may pose significant challenges. We also oftentimes lack data about wild populations. Rarely do we know how many we exactly have. And also for health condition, very often we lack base data. And something that we try to avoid at all costs, but as is in the process of rescue with the help of the general public that doesn't know any better, there is contact with domestic animals in the process, which exposes our rescuees to zoonotic diseases from domestic animals. AKA examples would be mange or distemper or fungal infections, and many, 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 many more. So just a short list here. There are species that are easier to rehabilitate, and then there are some that are more challenging. High stress species examples would be songbirds. There are in the States, there's at least one specialist, and I'm sure there are several, but it takes really a specialization to work with songbirds because they are very, very prone to stress. And as you remember from our talk about the assessment and examination, stress alone can lead to shock and death. Water birds are also challenging due to their adaptation to living in water, and you always have to put extra effort into cushioning to avoid pressure sores. Conflict species, because of course you want to avoid them causing further conflict if you release them again. To give just one example, large species can be quite difficult. So predators, large predators, jaguars, pumas, are all an extra challenge on top. Primates are by no means easy to rehabilitate. It takes many years of continuous stages to go through for these animals, which often enter as babies, to go through the process into sub-adulthood in a socialized troop that then gets gradually prepared for life in the trees and then is monitored over weeks and months and ultimately years post-release. So a lot of effort and manpower to go into it. But for both species here in Belize, we have well-established programs here in Belize as well as in other countries in Central and South America. But yeah, so much on challenges. Sorry, it's a really long list, but there is a lot of, again, myths and misconceptions that need to be clarified to have a realistic idea before engaging in this science. And then all in all, to me personally, it truly is one of the most rewarding experiences ever to see an animal that went from almost certain death through the different stages and steps that can take from days to weeks to months to, in some species, years, and then returning to the wild. And in some cases, we have the luck to then have the long-term follow-up, like the example of our logo animal, which is the little monkey, who has now been in the wild for over 5 years and fathered more than 10 offspring. So, and he would have most definitely died had he not been rescued. To me, it doesn't get much better than that. But the challenges abound. So let's come to step number 1, the assessment. We did talk about this already in the health assessment presentation. This is very tricky. So for your wildlife cases, you want to get the name and contact for the person, the geographic location, bit of the setting, what is the problem encountered, and what is the species? Because yeah, your first challenge, back to challenges again, is to really determine what is the species. And then what is its life stage? It is very different whether there is a baby or an adult encountered, be it on the ground or in a tree. What happens to be the problem, what can be causing it, will then all guide you towards possible responses. So for this, we actually have a pocket guide here for Belize that helps along a bit more specifically. But in most cases, this assessment really needs to be conducted or assisted by a trained professional, because it is very, very common that species are misidentified. It is also very common for normal behavior of species to be interpreted as abnormal. So humans rescue animals that really do not need rescuing. Is actually kidnapping that is happening there very commonly, with the best of intentions, but lack of knowledge about species and life stage and behavior. And what makes it even more important to be guided in this assessment are the risks for injury and disease transmission. So training for protective equipment and every species is really crucial to be able to do this safely after having learned enough about the biology, behavior, and basic health assessment of every species. So yeah, repeat, this may need to be conducted by a trained professional. Here in Belize, we do have a hotline that was created to do just that. And we do have a list of about 10 different specialized organizations and some more individuals that work with the forest department to actually provide advice and assistance for different species and problems. So just call. But before you intervene, figure out if this animal really needs help. So wait a moment before you do anything. Don't think help is needed until you have assessed this properly. So I already mentioned intended rescues turning into kidnapping, which is so common in the US and some other countries as well, that fawns are seen crouching in the grass and interpreted as orphans, not realizing that in this species, mom disappears for 12 hours or up to 12 hours, and the fawn is just trying to hide inconspicuously and does not need rescuing. So it's called fawn napping. Please avoid it and tell others about it. Absence of the mother does not mean this animal must be an orphan. So again, repeat, learn natural history, biology, and behavior for all the species you may encounter in order to be able to do this assessment. It takes a lot of base knowledge. Before you capture anything, you want to have this properly assessed, or you take the risk of causing the animal harm through the stress all the way to fatalities, and you take a lot of risk for yourself. So some examples for common non-emergencies, fledgling birds. A picture from the internet here. This is a common situation where people don't know that these fledglings may spend up to a week on the ground, during which time their parents are still caring for them. So the response is to actually step back and watch quietly from a distance and observe if parents, aka similar looking birds, can be seen tending to this fledgling. There are some exceptions, predators in the area that cannot be contained, aka dogs or cats that are about to eat this little fledgling and they cannot be contained. Then the fledgling may have to be lifted out of the immediate danger zone within a close range to ensure that the parents observe out of the yard. But these fledglings do not have to go into a rehabilitator, but should be left alone unless injured. And how do you recognize a fledgling? So here you can see, again, by species, you can also see typical signs on the beaks that are different in the baby birds, but the fluff is something that's common to all of, or most fledglings, where you can see these little down feathers that are still visible. So more important to learn when not to pick up an animal than to go out there and just try to rescue and make things worse. Stay safe, avoid kidnapping. Yeah, so wait up to 12 hours and observe before intervening. There are tricks that you can find for other North American species as well to try to assess if parents are still caring for these. And parents are always the best to care for these animals. In rehabilitation, it is a lot more challenging. There is a lot of risks for the animals. It takes more time, and nobody can do it as well as mama in nature. Also, what some don't realize, you can put a nest back up if there are chicks still in there. And if the nest is completely missing or destroyed, you can improvise nests as well. And again, there are instructions that can be found for that. It needs to then be closely monitored, and you should be in touch with your local wildlife rehabilitator. But again, sometimes these animals do not have to leave the site and go into a rehab center, but they can stay right on site in an improvised nest. So these are just crazy pictures, or this is a crazy picture of the internet. And this here is only a temporary shelter to get an animal to safety because it doesn't have a roof over it. We have used a bucket nest for some parrots, margarine pots, all sorts of receptacles can be used for this. So when there are, of course, situations where it's pretty clear that an animal may need to be captured, adult animals that don't try to escape when approached are definitely very suspicious, but it requires you recognizing them as adult animals. And of course, you have to keep in mind rabies. So an adult animal that behaves abnormally and lets you approach is very risky or suspicious. And then again, if you see an animal and you think it needs rescuing and you're chasing it for 2 hours, then it may not need rescuing, but you may in fact be harassing this animal. Keep that in mind. But then there are these obvious injuries on animals where you may still see blood, open wounds, a limb that is not used, a wing that is drooping, or bones protruding, an animal that is not able to move, or a rather small but serious injury are maggots. Wounds with maggots are also an emergency that do require assistance. Of course, an animal that is trapped or hung or stuck in trash needs help. That does need an intervention. Common behavior is seen when raptors are along the roadside and spread their wings out, which is then mistaken for injured birds. So how do we recognize the emergency? Again, summary: obvious signs of injury: bleeding, protruding bones, cannot fly, walk, escape, wounds with maggots. Before intervening, contact an expert unless you have training and know this species. Check out North American Wildlife Rehabilitation Association and International Wildlife Rehabilitators Council, and check the list of rehabilitators in for your area and or the species that you see. And always remember that extreme caution is required with bats and unusually friendly mammals. For us here, the bats are the main rabies vector. Note this differs in your different states, countries, and regions. So it's not bats everywhere. It may be raccoons and foxes. Always be careful, even when faced with an emergency, to keep in mind your own safety. And with that, we will end this first section. Thanks so much for your attention. Please do send me your questions, and I look forward to hear from you.